That's what strikes you first. Not merely in windows, it's everywhere. Streets laid from glass, corridors polished like mirrors, bridges suspended between towers that rise until they vanish into mist. Reflections layered upon reflections, blending so seamlessly that you can no longer distinguish between the city beneath your feet and the one just out of reach. Skybound isn't a city. It's a system. A realm without ground, without horizon. Only spiraling causeways, vertical avenues, and the persistent hum of electricity threading invisibly through its architecture. From up here, it seems flawless. Every structure shaped by light and silence, built for frictionless movement. No sharp edges, no wasted spaces. A vast machine wearing the skin of a metropolis. But look closer. The streets loop subtly, defying logic. Overhead displays flicker just half a second too late, as if hesitating, catching up to reality. Footsteps follow behind you, yet vanish the moment you turn. Doors open, but not always back to the places you left. The cafeterias remain open at all hours, but no one ever stays. Dry cleaners maintain an impeccable facade of pressed garments, yet no one sleeps in the same place twice. You can sit at a booth, order coffee, and watch the world flow by. But you can never pause, never truly rest. Names vanish from records overnight. Entire levels darken without warning. No alerts, no inquiries. Only silence, as if the system quietly corrects its own missteps. And then, there are the pylons, enormous structures rising above the highest platforms, ancient and out of place, relics that predate Skybound itself. They stand silent and unexplained. People vanish into their shadows, chasing whispers of escape. They do not return. Yet the lights remain steady. The city moves on, perfectly tuned, flawlessly indifferent. But beneath that perfection lies the error, the fracture. Because the glass isn't just reflecting the city, it's reflecting something else, something watching. Two. Orlen sat at his usual corner booth, occupying the same quiet stretch of time he'd inhabited for, how long now? Days, weeks. Time in Skybound didn't move. It looped, folded, splintered. He traced the table's smooth, sterile grey surface, fingertips finding no imperfections. Nothing ever changed here. Except him, perhaps. He rolled the Netsuke between his fingers, small, smooth, solidly alien in this place of sharp perfection and digital order. An anomaly in a world that did not tolerate anomalies. Like him. Outside, the glass corridors spiraled upward in precise curves, fracturing sunlight into patterns that danced like reflections on water. Platforms drifted past, passengers suspended in predetermined loops, each destination carefully planned. Cass watched a figure step onto a lift, its reflection elongated impossibly before dissolving as the lift descended. Click. The Netsuke tapped lightly against his knuckles, its presence both reassuring and unsettling. His coffee, untouched, rested in its standard-issue ceramic cup. It had arrived precisely 3 seconds after he'd sat down, as always. No words exchanged, no human interaction required. Just the silent precision of the system, anticipating needs before they were voiced. Perfect efficiency, perfectly wrong. Cass released a slow breath. Across the cafeteria, the man was there again. Same table, same coffee, same subtle irregularity. Cass had noticed him before. Weeks of identical mornings, identical actions, repeated like clockwork, but never quite aligning with reality. The man's fingers tapped the tabletop in rhythm. 3 short taps, 1 long pause. Silence. Cass recognized it. 6 weeks running. Same rhythm, same irregular pattern. It meant nothing. It meant everything. Above, the lights flickered gently. A brief hitch, hardly noticeable, but noticeable enough. Cass's fingers froze. Netsuke pressed against his knuckles. Another flicker. Longer now. Deliberate. Skybound didn't glitch. It never hesitated. Yet something here was hesitating. Then, a faint chime, barely audible beneath the perpetual hum of machinery. A quiet anomaly, easily dismissed. Cass closed his fingers firmly around the Netsuke. The chime sounded again. Longer. Distorted. Familiar. Not from here. Not from a cafeteria. Another flicker. The tapping had stopped. Cass glanced up. The man at the table had vanished, though the cup remained, untouched, steam drifting upward like a whisper. Cass stood, leaving his own coffee abandoned. The chime sounded again, louder, insistent. This time, from outside. Through the glass, the streets shifted, not physically, but somehow more disturbingly. A hollow screen displayed an event that didn't exist, counting down to something imminent. A faint scent drifted through the filtered air. Metallic sweet, synthetic, cloying. Perfume. Cass moved toward the exit, feeling the geometry of the city warp subtly around him, impossible angles twisting into unnatural shapes. Behind him, the doors closed softly, an exhale from something vast, invisible, and waiting. Cass kept moving. Survival meant motion. Cass walks deeper. The corridor extended further than he remembered. Longer, smoother, more liquid in the reflection beneath his feet. Had he walked this way before? He must have. Yet now, it stretched out of memory, becoming unfamiliar with every step. The lights along the corridor pulsed softly, tinged with amber, unusual, like sunlight filtered through something unseen. The scent of perfume had grown heavier now, suffusing the air, a sweet metallic fragrance that tugged at something buried deep within memory. Ahead, a figure stood perfectly still, waiting, watching. Cass slowed, shifting his weight just enough to remain ready without betraying intention. The sentinels had always been passive observers. Now their attention felt active, heads angled subtly, tracking his movements. But this was not what drew his attention. Something else held him. His reflection was wrong. It moved too slowly, lagging behind his motions by just a fraction, an echo slightly out of time. Cass raised his hand, and the mirror image followed late, hesitating unnaturally, fingers twitching as if uncertain of their role. Cass clenched his jaw. Not a glitch. Something else. The city wasn't merely reacting. It was adjusting. It was aware. He turned a corner, stepping into view of a wide, panoramic window. Skybound stretched outward, curving into infinity, its shapes familiar, yet subtly changed. One structure stood out starkly against the sky, a tower he'd never seen before. Imposing, undeniable, out of place. He tightened his grip on the Netsuke. If he stopped, would the anomaly correct itself, erasing his path back? The thought lingered, slippery and uncertain. He didn't hold on to it. He didn't dare. Forward, always forward. Three. Another notification. Quiet, persistent, hovering at the edge of her vision, patient but insistent. An anomaly tag. Minor, harmless, easily overlooked. Just another subtle irregularity, like a whisper beneath layers of silence. She blinked it aside. The interface adjusted automatically, realigning data streams, recalibrating predictions. Normal. Except it wasn't. The deviation was slight, just a ripple beneath layers of carefully calculated probability curves. A shadow without a source. An unidentified presence. One the network had neither flagged nor corrected. It waited quietly, unresolved, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. Her fingertips hovered above the interface, hesitating. That was new. She wasn't supposed to hesitate. Another pulse echoed through her, a disruption in her own internal rhythm, subtle but distinct. She dismissed the alert. But forgetting wasn't that simple. Another notification appeared, blinking softly at the corner of her sight line. Just another anomaly, negligible on its own. A rounding error, perhaps. A timestamp misplaced. Yet it persisted. Her fingers moved automatically, initiating a secondary scan, tracing pathways she had no reason to trace. She wasn't investigating, not officially. She was merely clarifying, satisfying a quiet impulse, rationalizing it as routine. But her heart knew differently. A secondary presence activated, not hers, but a passive watcher embedded within the system. The data shifted subtly beneath her fingertips, adapting, responding. Someone else was aware. A fragment appeared. Not a word, not a thought. Just a quiet presence surfacing unbidden. In. Another ripple. Rin. A sound shaping itself from silence, incomplete, invasive. Then finally, Orlen. It felt less like remembering and more like reconstructing, a fragmented directive assembling itself without consent, subtly threading into her own awareness. It lingered, intangible, yet undeniable, like the breath of someone unseen at her shoulder. She dismissed the query sharply, forcing closure. It meant nothing. But she knew better. Why now? Another deviation surfaced. Two contradictory values occupying the same space simultaneously. Both correct. Both impossible. She adjusted the filters, but the anomaly remained unresolved, shimmering quietly like an unanswered question. A directive flashed briefly across her vision. An alert from above, carefully vague, instructing her to monitor irregular pathways. Someone else had noticed. She hesitated, a heartbeat too long, then saved the raw data to an encrypted subdirectory. Just a precaution. Immediately the network responded. An imperceptible recalibration pulse, subtle but deliberate. She felt it, like an exhale behind her ear, an awareness pressing gently against her own. It knew. Isenya leaned back slightly, fingertips hovering above the interface. A test, then. She had touched something that preferred not to be touched. She initiated another query, intentionally ambiguous, a deliberate misdirection. She waited, senses sharp for any subtle shift in the response. It came immediately. Not a barrier, not an alarm, but a quiet, precise recalibration. The network wasn't preventing her actions, it was adapting to them. Four. The chimes struck, out of rhythm. Just barely, but unmistakably wrong. A misstep in a sequence crafted to perfection, slicing through the sterile silence and rewiring the moment, cracking open a door Isenya hadn't realized existed. Upper-tier corridor, transit only, structured purely for movement, a space carefully engineered to prevent lingering. The walls wide, sterile, reflective, uninviting. Access here had been seamless, automated. Biometric clearance at the transit hub, frictionless passage through security checkpoints, the barely perceptible hum of calibrated air pressure guiding her steps. She wasn't meant to pause, wasn't supposed to linger. The others moved past, precisely choreographed, their gazes distant, minds occupied elsewhere. But among them were anomalies. People who moved with subtle hesitations, steps just slightly misaligned with expectation. She recalled a woman by an access node, frozen in front of her own reflection, as though unsure of her own identity. Another figure at an intersection, pausing as if recalculating a forgotten trajectory. A shadow of uncertainty in an otherwise flawless pattern. Isenya had been dispatched here for a reason. Reviewing discrepancies. Minor delays flagged in upper-tier transit systems. Insignificant, yet someone had insisted on her oversight. The choice felt deliberate, as though she were being nudged towards something unseen. She hadn't expected clarity, only patterns. Faint signals hidden beneath noise, subtle distortions waiting to surface. But beneath expectation lay a strange sense of inevitability, an intuition whispering that this review wasn't random. Then the corridor shifted, not memory exactly, more a spectral echo, like sensing the presence of something long erased yet somehow lingering. A whisper of familiarity she couldn't place. The corridor seemed slightly longer now, its lights pulsing fractionally slower, tinted an unnatural amber. Her steps felt heavier, like walking through air subtly resisting her presence. This was no calibration error. She would have known. She always knew. Recognition, not confusion. An internal acknowledgement of something already embedded in her thoughts. A shift, a tell, a deviation already integrated into her awareness. Annoying, yet undeniable. Keep moving. She repeated the mantra silently. Keep moving, ignore it. Let the system smooth it away. It always did. 5. Isenya worked with time, but not in the way philosophers romanticized. Her discipline was precise, mechanical, governed by probability logistics and predictive modeling. Her title, Future Analyst, was suitably neutral, clean, efficient, emotionless. Her job was simple, at least in theory, to ensure the present never drifted beyond its assigned boundaries. She monitored the subtle shifts, minor anomalies, and recalibration sequences, not the noisy kind that surfaced from personal decisions, but the invisible, systematic kind. Most anomalies were subtle, quiet, easily smoothed over. But lately, nothing was clean. Corrections had increased in frequency, small but persistent. Errors quietly smoothed over, hidden in plain sight, invisible unless you knew precisely what to look for. She knew. She always knew. And then, the sound. It shouldn't have registered, but it resonated clearly in her memory. She flicked open her wrist panel, pulling up recent auditory logs. Nothing. No recorded anomaly. Yet she had heard it. The first act of defiance, a fraction of hesitation. Normally she'd let it pass, let the system resolve it, automated recognition of patterns no human intuition could match. But today, she refused. Her fingers moved swiftly, activating a restricted channel, bypassing standard clearances meant for higher-tier analysts, those tasked only with maintenance, never curiosity. It was dangerous, but she knew the system's blind spots intimately. She'd constructed many of them herself. There it was, a tiny delay, a flicker buried in the data, subtle enough to vanish unnoticed. Normally she'd erase it, cleanly, perfectly. Instead, she flagged it. Quietly, deliberately, without explanation. She closed the unauthorized feed and walked away. Nothing had happened, except something had. She just didn't understand what, yet. The aftermath begins. The shift was subtle, too subtle. A security node refreshed mid-cycle, despite no scheduled update. A co-worker's glance lingered, just slightly too long, uncertain, before snapping back into practiced indifference. A system synchronization hesitated, an extra beat, verifying data it had no reason to doubt. Coincidence, surely. But it wasn't. By the third shift, the fourth, she felt it. Someone had noticed, not directly, not explicitly, but the system had subtly recalibrated, adapting itself around her decision. A silent, reflexive response to her curiosity. She hovered her hand above her wrist panel, fighting the impulse to re-examine her flagged anomaly. The act of observing was now risky, transforming her from observer to observed. She lowered her hand carefully, adjusted her posture, and moved forward. For now, she would do nothing openly, but she would remain alert. She reached the security checkpoint, embedded seamlessly into the corridor wall. Standard verification process, routine and predictable, except it wasn't routine. The panel remained active, recently accessed, too recently. She eyed the indicators carefully. The session hadn't timed out. Someone had left hurriedly, carelessly leaving traces behind. That was a breach of protocol. Her gaze sharpened, instinctively analyzing the interface. A data fragment flickered at the edge, a deleted but poorly scrubbed record, glitching softly in and out. A ghost of someone else's mistake. A familiar mistake. She had made it herself, once. Whoever had accessed this panel had seen the same anomaly. They were tracking it too. She straightened, breathing quietly through her teeth. The corridor stretched empty and pristine, but she knew better than to trust appearances. She wasn't alone. Something shifted, a movement, barely detectable, at the very periphery of her vision. She turned slowly, deliberately, pretending to study the panel again. Peripheral awareness was more reliable than direct confrontation. The panel flickered. The session abruptly terminated. Not by her action. The system had noticed. Either her presence or the anomaly itself had triggered the shutdown. Too late to deny involvement now. Footsteps echoed softly, matching the ambient rhythm of the corridor. deliberate yet subtle, too close to be coincidence. Isenya remained still, pulse steady but muscles taut. Running was not an option. Running implied guilt, confirmation. Instead, she turned slightly, just enough to register a shape in the periphery. A figure stood distant, yet intentional. Not security, no uniform, no obvious threat. But the intent was clear. They were watching, waiting, shadowing. She turned first, decisively breaking eye contact. Let them follow if they chose. She walked, deliberately calm, projecting neutrality with each step. The corridor ahead was polished perfection, too perfect. Now it felt like a stage, her every movement part of an unspoken script. The footsteps adjusted, confirmed. She wasn't just being observed, she was being tracked. The air thickened, carrying an electric anticipation, not fear, exactly, but recognition. She quickly assessed her options. Engage, too many unknowns. Disappear, tempting but impractical. The corridors didn't offer easy exits without preparation. Turn the game, shift the balance. She slowed subtly, deliberately altering pace just enough to communicate awareness. Ahead, a door slid open silently. Not at her command. She didn't hesitate, didn't allow herself the luxury. But her pulse quickened, a single sharp beat of recognition.
The system had intervened.
Invitation or trap, it didn't matter. The corridor pressed around her, heavy and expectant. A decision already made, not hers. Then, a flicker. Movement, barely registered. Another shadow. Before she could react, the door hissed shut, sealing something away, or sealing her in. 6. Isenya turned sharply, recalibrating her route. A corridor was too exposed. Too many eyes, too many angles. She needed somewhere quiet, overlooked, neutral ground. A cafeteria. She entered quietly, instantly scanning the environment. The familiar drone of machinery and scattered murmurs greeted her. Safe, routine, anonymous. Except, he was there. Cass. Sitting silently at the edge, posture tense with careful neutrality. Waiting. Recognition flashed between them, sharp and immediate. This was no coincidence. He was involved somehow. She felt the connection instantly, electric, charged with awareness. The silence lingered, stretched beyond comfort, an invitation to suspicion. A warning. Then a sound threaded softly through the space. Mechanical, low frequency. Not an alarm, not an announcement. A hidden signal. Cass shifted minutely. A fractional adjustment loaded with meaning. Recognition pulsed through her, clear and cold. Something was wrong. The air stilled unnaturally, waiting for a response, poised before correction. She moved instinctively, eyes flicking toward the entrance. Two figures stood just inside, motionless, deliberate, poised with intent. Not security, something else, something worse. Cass murmured, barely audible yet clear enough. Move. Not a request, an imperative. She obeyed instantly, quietly. They exited together as the first voice sliced through the air behind them. You. Stop. Neither turned back. In the corridor, silence enfolded them both, heavy with unspoken acknowledgements. They shared a moment, brief, tense, full of silent understanding. She didn't move. Neither did he. Words felt unnecessary. They already knew too much. She glanced sideways, subtly registering his presence without direct confrontation. He mirrored her careful avoidance, aware but unwilling to speak first. Silence was safer. Cass nodded slightly, a gesture ambiguous enough to mean anything or nothing, then stepped away calmly, unhurried. Just another ordinary movement in a sequence carefully maintained. She watched him go, counted the beats, then moved forward herself. Slowly, calmly. Behind her, Cass vanished quietly around the corner, not fleeing, merely fading back into anonymity. Isenya's pulse eased slowly, muscles still coiled, thoughts sharp with clarity. Something had shifted irrevocably. She continued onward, carefully, deliberately, not running, not hiding, but undeniably aware. She noted the reflections along the glass panels, each step echoed by her mirror image perfectly. Until, abruptly, it didn't. Half a second's hesitation, a brief lag in reflection. She didn't slow down, didn't show recognition, but she knew someone else was watching. Someone always was. 7. Cass didn't go to ground. He had nowhere to go. The cafeterias were the closest thing he had to a home, transient spaces that promised anonymity, a cycle of moments without memory. Today, he chose one near the lower transit hub, bathed in muted amber light, its walls engineered to dampen sound, and where servers asked no questions. He ordered something neutral, ordinary, invisible. The warmth of the ceramic mug grounded him momentarily. The comforting simplicity of steam, porcelain, and background machinery hum. Then she sat down across from him. Cass didn't react immediately, sipping slowly to measure the moment before acknowledging her presence. When he did glance up, she was already observing him, calm, elbow propped casually on the table, fingers resting lightly at her temple. She belonged neither to the place nor the moment. Her arrival calculated, intentional. Cass Orlen, she said, speaking his name with a familiarity he hadn't granted. They say, you have a reputation. He offered no immediate reply, his expression neutrally appraising, calculating. People say a lot of things. Her smile flickered slightly, a subtle edge of amusement. They do. Cass felt the room constrict slightly, recognition tightening in his chest. A realization he hadn't requested, an acknowledgement he hadn't wanted. I don't remember signing up for such a thing, he said evenly, setting the mug down. No one ever does, she said, studying him thoughtfully. That's the trouble. The silence lingered, full and unspoken. Cass tapped a finger lightly against the ceramic surface, never breaking eye contact. You got a name? Her smile broadened minutely. Orlen. Nothing else. No context offered or needed. Her presence already explained itself clearly enough. Cass understood immediately. She was here because of him. Orlen allowed the silence to hang, unhurried, letting the weight of implications settle comfortably between them. Cass didn't rush to fill it either, understanding the stakes of speaking first. Finally, she broke the silence gently, deliberately. I have something for you. Cass raised an eyebrow, only slightly. That so? She reached into her pocket, placing a small cloth-wrapped object carefully onto the table. Nothing elaborate, just precise, intentional. Cass hesitated briefly before gently unfolding the cloth, revealing another Netsuke. Identical. Impossible. He studied it without revealing any trace of recognition. What am I looking at? Lauren tilted her head, curious if his ignorance was genuine. You don't know? Cass let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly. Should I? She lifted the Netsuke gently, turning it in her fingers, inspecting it with detached curiosity. An old-world artifact. Must have had meaning, or value, maybe both. He leaned back slightly, expression neutral. And this means something to me. Her eyes held his, unflinching. You tell me. Cass shrugged, feigning disinterest, lifting his mug once more. You're the one who brought it. Another silence, deliberately stretched. Then she smiled, soft, but knowing. I did. Cass tapped the table softly again, a subtle signal of impatience. You want to tell me where you got this? Her smile remained steady, her voice measured. Depends. Do you really want to know? Something in her tone made the room feel tighter. He recognized the subtle threat beneath the casual surface. Objects like this, physical, sentimental, and burdened with implied worth, didn't belong here. Skybound had stripped away such attachments, replaced meaning with structure. Yet there it lay. Lauren watched him closely. Someone wants answers. About this object. Where it came from, how it got here, every detail. Cass nodded, careful to keep his tone neutral. Of course. She wrapped the Netsuke carefully, efficiently. Take your time to answer. She rose smoothly, adjusting her coat casually, as though their conversation had been incidental, nothing more. Cass waited to see if she'd offer anything else. She didn't. She turned, measured and composed, heading for the exit. Cass exhaled softly, then spoke quietly, lightly, testing her reaction. You sure you don't want to stay? Coffee's just getting good. She didn't pause, just lifted 2 fingers in an easy farewell gesture as she disappeared through the doorway, leaving Cass alone with his thoughts and the silent weight of what she'd left behind. 8. Cass drummed his fingers softly against the ceramic mug, the rhythm quiet but deliberate. Then he reached into his pocket, fingertips brushing against the Netsuke he'd carried all along. 2 identical objects, one too many. A quiet tension settled in, threading through the air like an unseen current. He ordered another coffee and watched the steam curl upward, dissipating gently, vanishing into nothingness. His attention, however, wasn't on the coffee. His mind circled the Netsuke, the impossibility of it. 2 identical objects, both real, both tangible, both wrong. He let his thumb trace the familiar contours in his pocket, feeling the smoothness, the shape he had memorized. The duplicate was gone, but its presence lingered, heavy in the air, a question he couldn't answer. Not yet. He understood it was likely a trap. Everything about it felt calculated. And yet, an old instinct stirred in him, the reckless part that always chose to step toward the unknown rather than away. Curiosity, desire, whatever he named it. He felt its pull, seductive and dangerous. He would play along, for now. Cass knew with certainty. If he hadn't been watched before, he was now. Every movement, every decision, logged and analyzed. His fingers moved restlessly against the mug again, a quiet rhythm marking time. He considered the Netsuke in his pocket, its familiar texture grounding him against the strange weight of the other. The one Lorin had reclaimed, its absence as tangible as its presence had been. Someone wanted answers. Origins, purpose, significance. Questions he hadn't asked. Questions he shouldn't even be able to answer. Lorin hadn't named who sent her, but she didn't need to. Whoever was behind this had reach, influence, and they'd made sure Cass felt the pressure of their interest. He leaned back slowly, deliberately casual, knowing that every move now was tracked, every action scrutinized. He tapped softly against his mug, an idle gesture filled with quiet defiance. They were watching. He let them. 9. The alarm sliced through the corridor, sharp and impersonal. Another drill cycling through the system. Isenya barely looked up. She knew the pattern, knew the protocol. Another necessary inconvenience. She didn't rush to join the queue. Urgency here was meaningless. Personnel moved in orderly lines, guided by habit and protocol rather than thought. She fell into place last, each step carefully measured. At the checkpoint stood the faceless. 6 silent figures, their movements fluid, efficient, almost graceful. They handed out gear mechanically, their presence a quiet reminder of Skybound's unspoken penalties. Isenya accepted her items, an Oxygen Plus mouthpiece and dark sunglasses. Just enough protection, not enough to obscure identity completely. The mouthpiece hissed softly as she fitted it. Oxygen-enhanced air chilling her breath slightly. Artificial, but comforting. The sunglasses dimmed her vision, filtering the harsh brightness. Then, outside, the platform extended sharply, a skeletal structure suspended above emptiness. The sky stretched endlessly around them, oppressive in its openness. Wind rushed silently, powerful and cold, carrying threats unseen yet constant. At this height, a mistake meant immediate, irreversible failure. Step, secure, hold. The drill was routine, yet the presence of the pylon made it impossible to dismiss entirely. Towering in the distance, ancient and inscrutable, its origin lost to history, purpose unknown, a relic tolerated but never explained. She stared at it, absorbing its mystery until the routine drew her back inside. Re-entry was silent, automated. Personnel dispersed, resuming their assigned roles without acknowledgement or reflection. Then, a flicker at her feet caught her eye. A small drone, palm-sized, twitching helplessly, abandoned by the system. It should have been logged and ignored. She knelt instead, closing her fingers gently around the metal frame, feeling its faint vibrations against her skin. Warmth radiated from strained motors, a quiet sign of struggle. Without thinking, she slipped it discreetly into her sleeve. She glanced up, pulse calm but senses sharp, and saw her. Lorin stood a short distance away, her gaze steady, knowing. A faint smile, a gesture of subtle acknowledgement. 2 fingers lifted slightly in a forbidden greeting. Isenya gave no outward sign of noticing, yet the recognition had landed, resonating deeply. She had just crossed an invisible boundary, one she hadn't fully realized existed. A confidant. 10. Then there was a miracle. The space was small, functional. The walls pulsed dimly with ambient light, their glow adjusting to the quiet rhythm of breath. The drone lay open, its tiny inner circuits exposed, a fractured thing, a failed process, a discarded error. Fingers moved with practiced ease, following the intricate paths of micro-wires, rerouting damaged connections, stabilizing weak points. The system didn't care for broken things. The system discarded them. But something about this one demanded attention. A fine adjustment. A recalibrated sequence. Then, the faintest tremor beneath fingertips. The rotor engaged for half a second, a near-silent pulse of movement, a flicker of life where none should be. For an instant, the low glow of the work light caught a reflection in the dark panel of the console, a single eye, a reaction, something unreadable, something unknown. Then it was gone. Just circuits and silence again. Just another machine. Just another function. And yet, the work continued. Above, in the glow of the observation post, a data packet flickered into existence. Anomalous repair event. Low priority. Logged and dismissed. Ptron's gaze barely flicked over the information, fingers tapping lightly against the console. Not a flag. Not yet. But the system had noted it. And so had he. Observed deviations. A web of data streams, silent and absolute, processed at scales beyond human perception. Numbers arranged in perfect sequences. Surveillance folded within itself, tracking motion, tracing logic. A system without bias, without hesitation. And yet, a node moved where it shouldn't have. A mapped sector unfolded, traced in real time. But something was off. The subject deviated, not randomly but with purpose. Calculations adjusted, paths realigned. It should have been noted. It should have been flagged. It wasn't. Down below, the figure walked. Inside a structure meant to contain, and yet it offered no resistance. The doors opened. The corridors cleared. The world shaped itself to his movements. It wasn't freedom. It was a space shifting around something it didn't understand. Ptron leaned forward, exhaling through his nose, amusement curling just beneath the surface. The system hesitated, and hesitation was the most interesting thing of all. Recalculations spun, light overlays shifting across his interface, adjusting variables, offering suggestions. Too soon. Let it breathe. He let his fingers drift across the interface, brushing the surface. Not yet. Let's see where he goes. Lines of permission. From this altitude, things had clarity. Everything above a certain threshold of privilege operated without friction. No obstructions, no requests, just pure access. The corridors of the upper levels were curated in real time, responding to preset directives. But access was not autonomy. Movement was still a calculation. So was silence. A figure passed through unseen thresholds, unchallenged. Not because she was free, but because she was recognized. Ptron barely moved, but the system responded anyway, highlighting her permissions, a different color than the others. The kind of access that had no justification, but was never questioned. He watched, and he let her pass. She had been given space to move, but space was also a design. Below, in mirrored corridors, other figures played their roles. Machines and people, nodes and functions, reflections and distortions, truth and image. The question had never been what was real. The question had always been, who decides? The observation post remained silent. Ptron settled back into his chair, watching the slow click of inevitability turn forward. Just a little more time. Just a little more proof. Then he would decide what to do with it. 11. The archive's threshold. Cass didn't deal in data. He wasn't trained to decipher system logs or parse patterns in weight distribution. But he knew when a trail was being erased, when conversations ended a second too soon, when a place should exist, but didn't. The clues weren't written. They were felt. The way certain corridors always seemed to redirect him, the way someone's gaze lingered half a second longer before snapping away. The absence of presence. The presence of absence. People didn't talk about the archive. But Cass had learned, through careful ignorance, that if you looked long enough for something that wasn't supposed to exist, eventually, it found you. Cass had been circling this mystery for how long now? He couldn't measure it in weeks or months. Time itself had blurred somewhere along the way, looping, shifting, slipping out of sequence like the distorted echoes of a forgotten conversation. The Netsuke had been his only constant. A riddle he hadn't chosen but had been forced to carry, its presence nagging at the edges of his thoughts, refusing to be dismissed. His investigation had been nothing but fragments. A door he didn't remember opening yet had clearly walked through. A name he never spoke aloud yet found scratched into the margin of a maintenance log. A security protocol that applied to him but shouldn't have existed. Cass had not found this place through intuition alone. The trail had been subtle, layered, scattered across faint traces, names that had vanished from records, transaction anomalies too deliberate to be dismissed, conversations abruptly cut short. Every dead end led to the same absence, the same nothing. And in Skybound, when nothing existed, it often meant something had been buried deep. Cass followed it, step by step, until the archive revealed itself, not as a place, but as an inevitability. He stood at the entrance, Netsuke cupped in his palm. It was a harmless object, a trinket, a carved remnant of some other world. But in his grasp, it felt like a foreign body, something that had slipped past the archive's meticulous order, a piece that did not belong, yet refused to be erased. He rolled it between his fingers, considering. Would it accept this? Would it take something that had no right to be here? Cass had returned many things to the archive before. Artifacts, fragments, anomalies. The system had swallowed them all without question. But this time, there was something different. The weight of the Netsuke felt heavier, or maybe the air itself had thickened around him, waiting. He took a breath and stepped forward. The archive's intake chamber was a place of absolute silence. A vast, temperature-controlled vault, where objects of significance were neither stored nor lost, merely catalogued into something beyond human perception. Here, time had no presence, only the seamless churn of record-keeping, where the past was neatly folded into an ever-expanding index of the present. He approached the nearest scanning node, a seamless glass surface, neither reflective nor dull, hovered mid-air, waiting for his submission. He placed the Netsuke down carefully. Nothing happened. The archive had a process. You placed an item, and in under a second, the system acknowledged its existence, categorized it, and absorbed it into the database. But this time, nothing. The silence stretched. The glass remained indifferent. The Netsuke didn't register. Cass watched as the node flickered once, not in failure, but in something else. hesitation. Then, without warning, the object vanished. Cass exhaled slowly. Maybe that was it. Maybe it was over. He turned to leave, but the moment his foot hit the threshold, his fingers brushed against something in his coat pocket. The Netsuke. Identical. Impossible. Cass didn't freeze. Freezing meant shock, and shock meant you still had the luxury of disbelief. He didn't have that luxury anymore. He walked away, expression neutral, but his mind cataloguing every second. The archive had rejected the object. Or maybe the system had returned it. Cass realized he had been running. He had to. Minutes, hours. He found a place to kneel down, crouching, holding. When had he ever been sweating? The water was pouring. Skybound, the edge of knowing. The balcony juts out into the cold air, suspended high above the city's canyons of glass and steel. Cass steps forward, boots meeting metal, the weight of it solid underfoot. No barriers, no warnings, no cameras. This isn't a place for visitors. The kind of height that makes you understand how small you are, without the dignity of fear. The city beneath him is not a city. Not in the way people like to think of them. Not streets and homes and districts. Not something that belongs to those who live in it. Skybound is a system of reflections, a labyrinth of light and glass, a place where nothing is built to be remembered, only indexed, only functional. Down below, the traffic flows like veins, pulsing through artificial corridors. The bridges connect towers like the strands of a web, not for people, but for movement itself. Cass watches, feeling. Not awe, not fear, just the faint, absurd sense that none of this was ever made to be understood from this angle. His hand slips into his coat pocket. His fingers close around the Netsuke. Still there. Still impossible. He lifts it, turns it over in his palm. The tiny carved figure is flawless. No scratches, no seams, no signs of duplication. The same weight, the same shape. As if the system hadn't rejected it at all, just made a copy and handed it back to him. He exhales, watching his breath dissipate into the sky, and for a brief second, he sees himself reflected in the tower glass. Not twice. Not as a glitch. Not as something wrong. Just him, in perfect clarity, standing there with something that shouldn't exist. His mind drifts back to the archive, to the moment the Netsuke vanished and reappeared in his pocket. The system had rejected it. Or had it? Maybe it had returned it, not as an error, but as a decision, a choice. He feels the weight of the Netsuke in his pocket, rolling it between his fingers. It's still there, still impossible. The city outside is a blur of light and mist, but Cass doesn't see it. He sees the archive's glass node, cold and indifferent, hesitating for the first time. He sees his own reflection in the tower glass, doubling for a fraction of a second, just like the Netsuke. If the system is broken, he thinks, what does that make me? The archive doesn't make mistakes. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't return what it takes. Cass knows this, but today it did, and that means something. Something no one accounted for. The world feels too big. The sky above him stretches past architecture, into a place where logic fades and something colder takes over. The lower districts disappear into mist, Whole sectors swallowed by clouds that shift like living things. And somewhere in between, Cass stands. Neither above nor below. Neither erased nor accounted for. For the first time, the feeling isn't just disorientation. It's something heavier, like he's already been forgotten. Like the system is trying to correct an absence that hasn't happened yet. Ptron arrived without ceremony, which in itself was a message. Cass was already there, sitting in his usual spot. But this time, he looked off. Not wrecked. Not shaken. Just like a man who had been somewhere else for a while and hadn't fully come back. His collar was slightly open, his sleeves pushed up unevenly, like he'd dressed without thinking about it. The kind of look that made you wonder if he'd just walked out of a dream or a fight, and even he wasn't sure which. Ptron slid into the seat across from him, barely sparing him a glance before reaching for a napkin. He placed it neatly in front of Cass. "Wipe your face. You look like you just came back from the void." Cass took the napkin without comment, rolling it between his fingers. "You ever experience a full system recalibration?" Ptron smirked. "I don't make a habit of standing too close to the edge." "Yeah?" Cass exhaled slowly, trying to reassemble the details in his head. "Then you wouldn't know what it feels like when the edge pulls you in." Ptron sat forward, fingers resting lightly on the table. He wasn't here to threaten. That was unnecessary. He was here to confirm. "You're looking for something that doesn't exist." Cass met his gaze, his usual cool intact. But there was something else now, something watching from behind his eyes. Funny, it keeps showing up anyway. Ptron smiled. A real one. Not forced, not polite. Just slightly entertained. But there was something in his expression, a flicker of thought Cass couldn't place. Not doubt, not hesitation, a recalibration. Something had changed, and Ptron was noticing it in real time. His head tilted slightly, gaze shifting, as if something unseen had passed between them. Cass followed his line of sight. Isenya sat a few tables away. She hadn't moved. Ptron exhaled, but not from exertion. It was something closer to recognition. "You're mistaking precision for control," he said, this time to her. Isenya didn't answer, but Cass could tell she was listening. For a brief moment, something aligned in her mind. A realization, not about the anomaly itself, but about its nature. She had been tracking patterns for years, but this was different. It wasn't a drift. It was an edit. Tron's hand hovered above the table for a moment. A small movement. An imperceptible test. And then, the lights flickered. Not as a failure. Not as a malfunction. But as if Skybound itself had momentarily lost certainty in what should come next. Not briefly. Not momentarily. For the first time in Skybound's engineered perfection, the system hesitated. The shift wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a siren or a system alarm. No crash, no collapse. Just the smallest, quietest hesitation. Cass noticed it first. Then he noticed something else. His coffee cup was still in his hand, and still on the table. She felt it too. A few meters away, a faceless figure froze mid-step. No sound, no malfunction, just absolute, unnatural stillness. Then it moved. Not forward, not back, but out of sequence. A head twitch, a flicker, a frame missing, then replaced. Cass's grip on the Netsuke in his pocket tightened. Ptron didn't speak. but Cass could feel his presence shift. Not physically, but perceptibly. The weight of a man who had just been forced to recognize something he didn't want to see. Somewhere outside this room, Skybound was running calculations it had never had to run before. The lights didn't just flicker now, they wavered, like the system itself was struggling to hold coherence. Isenya finally moved. She placed both hands flat on the table, a decision made. Her expression was unreadable, but her stillness had transformed from passive to something else. Cass knew that look. She wasn't waiting for an explanation. She was about to act. And for the first time in Skybound, the system was watching them back. Then, nothing. The lights steadied. The moment passed. The weight in the air evaporated, like the pressure of a storm just before the first crack of thunder. Except the thunder never came. Ptron adjusted his sleeve, expression as unreadable as ever. If he had registered the shift, he wasn't going to show it. Cass exhaled and glanced toward Isenya. Her hands were still flat against the table. Finally she moved, pushing herself back from the seat. A slow, measured action. No one spoke as they stood. The cafeteria doors slid open with a smooth, mechanical whisper, as if welcoming them into a world that had already decided to erase what had just occurred. Cass stepped through first. His mind catalogued every detail, the stillness, the absence, the emptiness of it all. The doors slid shut behind them. The cafeteria remained unchanged. The tables were neatly arranged. The lights glowed their usual sterile white. The air was still, too still, and the faceless figure was gone. Not moved, not walked away. Gone. Cass reached into his pocket. The Netsuke was gone too. He stopped walking, stared at the empty space where it should have been. His fingers pressed against fabric. Nothing. No weight, no warmth, no trace that it had ever been there. His pulse remained steady, but his mind was already running through a dozen possibilities. The system hadn't taken it from him. It had removed it, a clean erasure, a silent correction. He kept walking, nothing to acknowledge, nothing to react to. But then, a few steps later, as the corridor stretched before them, Cass slipped his hand into his pocket again. The Netsuke was back, heavy, solid, but now warm to the touch. And as his fingers brushed against its surface, he felt something else. The pattern had changed.